A tugboat crew thought they pulled trash from a river. What they actually pulled out took 18 years, 3 countries, and 1 microscopic mistake to explain. And even now, the most important question has never been answered. It was supposed to be an ordinary morning, January 6, 1999, Krakow, Poland. The kind of cold that doesn't just chill you, it settles into you. The kind that makes the whole world feel heavier, slower, like even the city itself was holding its breath. The tugboat Elka moved through the dark water of the Vistula River just before dawn. The crew had done this 100 times. Routine work, unremarkable, the kind of shift you forget before it's even over. Then the engine groaned. Something had caught in the propeller. The captain assumed it was debris. It happened constantly on the Vistula. Old tarps, factory waste, tangled plastic from the industrial district upstream. He ordered the crew to clear it. What they pulled onto that metal deck changed everything. At first glance, it looked like pale, waterlogged material, large, shapeless from a distance. The kind of thing you'd throw back without a second thought. But something was wrong. Not obviously. Not immediately. Just a feeling. The kind your brain registers before your eyes catch up. The shape was too deliberate, too structured. One of the crewmen stepped closer, and that's when he saw it. A human ear, still attached to the side of the material. The deck went completely silent. Not the normal kind of silence. The kind that spreads. The kind that tells every instinct in your body what you are looking at should not exist. Forensic teams arrived within the hour. The material was transported under full secrecy. No press, no statements. The investigators needed to understand what they were looking at before the city found out. Inside the lab, the examination began. And slowly, detail by detail, the truth assembled itself into something no one in that room was prepared for. What they had recovered was not a body. It was not a wound. It was not the result of an accident or an explosion or anything that could be explained by chaos. What they were looking at had been made deliberately, carefully by someone who understood exactly what they were doing. The evidence told a story that no investigator wanted to read. This wasn't random violence. This was precision. This was patience. And somewhere out there in the narrow streets of Krakow, in the cafes, in the university hallways, maybe even watching the police station from across the bridge, the person responsible was still walking free. To understand what happened on that river, you have to go back 6 weeks. November 12, 1998. Katarzyna Zowada was 23 years old. She was the kind of person who existed at the edges of a room, never the center. Quiet, withdrawn, deeply intelligent, but carrying a grief that had slowly dimmed her from the inside out. After her father's death, she had retreated into herself in a way that even her closest friends couldn't fully reach. She studied religious history at the Jagiellonian University, one of Poland's most prestigious institutions. Ancient buildings, cobblestone corridors, the kind of place that feels like it exists slightly outside of time. But lately, she had stopped attending lectures. She was receiving treatment for depression at a psychiatric clinic, a place she visited regularly, quietly, without drawing attention. Because that was Katarzyna. She moved through the world like she was trying not to disturb it. On November 12th, she had an appointment. She was supposed to meet her mother there. She never arrived. At first, the city didn't notice. The system classified her as a possible voluntary disappearance. A young woman with depression, a history of withdrawal, no signs of struggle. These cases came in constantly. Most of them resolved themselves within days. So the response was slow. Too slow. Her mother filed the report. Flyers were posted on damp telephone poles across the city. Her name was entered into the missing persons register. And then winter came. Snow blanketed Krakow's old streets. covered whatever traces she might have left behind. The city moved on the way cities do, with indifference, with routine, with the quiet cruelty of ordinary life continuing as if nothing had changed. But the river remembered. The river always remembers. When the DNA results came back, the investigation transformed overnight. Material recovered from the Vistula was confirmed to be connected to Katarzyna Zowada, but it wasn't just a discovery. It was a statement. Because what the forensic team found was not the result of rage or chaos or a crime of passion. The evidence pointed to something far more disturbing, something that suggested the person responsible hadn't acted impulsively. They had planned, specialized. Materials were found embedded in the evidence, the kind not available in ordinary hardware stores or pharmacies, the kind used in controlled, professional environments, laboratories, research facilities, places where precision was the standard and not the exception. Whoever did this had knowledge, not theoretical, not borrowed. Practiced. Lead investigator Jacek Majira spent long hours in the evidence room, studying every detail. He was a man who had worked serious crimes for over a decade. He had seen things that stayed with him long after the cases closed. But this was different. He said later that what unsettled him most wasn't the brutality. It was the calm behind it. This wasn't a man who lost control, he told his team. This was a man who never lost control. The psychological profile that emerged over the following weeks was precise and terrifying. They weren't looking for someone chaotic, someone impulsive, someone who would eventually make a loud, obvious mistake. They were looking for someone organized, disciplined, someone living a completely normal life on the surface, a neighbor, a colleague, a man who smiled at you in the hallway while hiding something underneath that most people couldn't even conceive of. Kind of person who is never suspected because they are too ordinary to suspect. As the investigation deepened, something else emerged. Katarzyna hadn't been chosen randomly. Her schedule was predictable. Her routes were consistent. She walked the same paths at the same times, day after day. She was, by her own nature, invisible to the world around her. Someone had noticed that. Someone had studied it. The investigators reconstructed her final weeks and found something chilling in the gaps, small moments, hours unaccounted for, windows where someone could have watched her, followed her, learned her without ever being seen themselves. She had been selected, not found, not stumbled upon. Chosen. That realization shifted something in the investigation, because it meant the person responsible wasn't a random predator acting on impulse. This was someone who had decided, deliberately, calmly, over a period of time, that Katarzyna was exactly what they were looking for. Then came the discovery that broke the entire city. Weeks after the investigation began cooling, after leads had dried up and resources had shifted, a passerby found something buried near the riverbank downstream, a small metal box, rusted, partially submerged in mud. Inside was a single photograph. Old, slightly faded. It showed a young woman walking alone on a university path, unaware, completely unaware. It was Katarzyna, taken from a distance, from a position where the photographer could not be seen. On the back of the photograph, written in small, precise handwriting, were 5 words. The fit was perfect. The room went silent when they read it, because this wasn't just evidence, this was communication. Killer wasn't hiding. They were watching the investigation unfold, and they wanted the investigators to know it. The box also contained material that matched the original evidence from the river. Which meant only one thing: the same person had returned to that location after the investigation had begun, and left this behind deliberately, not out of carelessness. Out of confidence. The profile shifted again. This wasn't just organized. This was someone who felt completely untouchable. Someone who had constructed such a perfect barrier between their public life and their hidden one that they had no fear of being found. And the most terrifying part? They were right, because in 1999, the technology didn't exist to find them. The microscopic evidence embedded in what was recovered, tiny fibers, specific particles, invisible markers that told the story of where this had been prepared, was beyond the reach of the tools available. The case went cold. The file grew thick. Thousands of pages, hundreds of leads that ended in silence. Katarzyna's family received no answers. The city tried to move on, and the killer walked free, past the police station, past the university, past the river, living the most ordinary life imaginable for 18 years. Asterisk. The man who watched the investigation. Some cases don't go cold. They go quiet. There's a difference. Cold means finished, abandoned, filed away in a drawer that nobody opens anymore. Quiet means something else entirely. Quiet means the file is still there, still breathing, waiting for the moment when the world finally catches up to what happened inside. The Katarzyna Zowada case was never cold. It was furious. By 2005, Krakow had transformed. The gray, post-communist heaviness of the 1990s had lifted. New buildings, new energy. European Union membership had brought money, movement, optimism. The cobblestone streets that once felt oppressive now attracted tourists from across the continent. But inside a specific room of the Krakow police department, a room that most officers walked past without looking at, a file sat on a shelf that had not been touched in months. Thousands of pages. Photographs. Lab reports. Witness statements that led nowhere. Psychological profiles of men who turned out to be innocent. Theories constructed carefully and then dismantled just as carefully. And at the center of all of it, a single unanswered question. Who? The detective who had originally led the investigation, Jacek Majira, had never fully let go. Even as new cases demanded his attention, even as years passed and the trail seemed to disappear entirely, he returned to that file. Again and again. Not officially, not always with department approval, just a man who couldn't accept that something this deliberate would go unanswered. Forever, he believed one thing above everything else. The killer had made a mistake. Just one. But somewhere in that evidence, in the invisible layers that 1999 technology couldn't read, the mistake was waiting. Patiently. The way the killer himself had once waited for Katarzyna in 2012. Everything changed. Not with a witness, not with a confession, not with a dramatic tip that broke the case wide open, with a decision. Poland's elite cold case division, operating under a classification that translated roughly to Archive X, formally reopened the Zowada file. Their reasoning was simple. Forensic science in 2012 was not forensic science in 1999. What had been invisible then was potentially readable now. The original evidence was brought out of climate-controlled storage, handled with extraordinary care, because after 13 years, every microscopic detail it still held was irreplaceable. There would be no second chances if they damaged it. Examination took months, and what they found, buried in layers so small they required technology that hadn't existed when the crime was committed, rewrote the entire geography of the investigation. The particles embedded within the evidence were not from the river. They were not from the streets of Krakow. They were not from any outdoor environment. They were from inside a controlled space, a place with regulated temperature and moisture, somewhere clean, somewhere professional, somewhere that a very specific type of work was done on a regular basis. The killer hadn't operated in chaos. They had operated in a laboratory. The Archive X team went back to the original suspect list, hundreds of names, most of them cleared years ago. Some dead, some who had moved out of the country, some who had simply faded from relevance as the investigation stalled, but cross-referenced against this new environmental data, against the specific profile of someone with access to a controlled biological workspace. The list collapsed dramatically. Until one name remained. Name that had appeared before, early in the original investigation, briefly in the periphery, questioned once, released, never formally considered a serious suspect because at the time, there was nothing concrete to hold against him. His name was Robert J. on paper. Robert J. was unremarkable. He lived alone in an apartment building in a quiet district of Krakow. He kept a routine. He paid his bills. He attended his local church regularly, a detail that neighbors mentioned often, almost as a character reference offered. Without being asked, he was the kind of man who existed without friction, who moved through his community without leaving marks, but his background told a different story. He had worked for years at a biological research institute, specifically in the department responsible for preparing and preserving animal specimens, skins, skeletal structures, biological material requiring technical precision and specialized chemical knowledge. He understood, at a professional level, exactly how organic material behaved, how it could be treated, how it could be preserved. Beyond his work history, investigators found something else as they dug deeper into his past. A pattern of behavior that individually meant little, but together formed a portrait that made the Archive X team go very still when they read it. Complaints during his military service, incidents described carefully in documents that had been filed and forgotten. A man who had always existed slightly outside the boundaries of what people considered normal, but never far enough outside to trigger serious intervention. Just far enough to be noticed. And then forgotten. Surveillance began in the spring of 2014. Quiet, careful, invisible. Asterisk. The team had learned from the case itself. If this was their man, he was someone who noticed things. Someone whose entire life had been built around observation, around patience, around the ability to exist in plain sight without drawing attention. They couldn't afford a single mistake. So they watched. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into months. Robert J.'s life looked, from the outside, exactly as ordinary as it had always appeared. Morning walks, grocery runs, church on Sundays. A man living out his quiet years without drama. But investigators are trained to look beneath routine. And beneath Robert J.'s routine, they found something that no amount of ordinary behavior could explain away. Whenever the Zowada case resurfaced in public, whenever a news anniversary piece ran, whenever a true crime discussion mentioned the Vistula Mystery, whenever anything connected to that January morning in 1999 entered the public conversation, Robert J. paid attention. Not with anxiety, not with the nervous, flinching attention of someone afraid of being caught. With interest, he sought the coverage out. Read it carefully. Watched it closely, the way someone watches a film they have already seen, checking whether the audience understood it correctly. One investigator on the surveillance team described it this way in his notes. He doesn't watch it like a suspect watches news about their own crime. He watches it the way an artist watches a review of their work. That observation, filed quietly in a surveillance log that wouldn't become public for years, was the moment that investigation stopped being a theory. It became certainty. In early 2017, a witness came forward, Someone who had stayed silent for 18 years, not out of indifference, not out of a lack of conscience, out of fear, the kind of fear that doesn't diminish with time, it just becomes familiar. A permanent presence you learn to live around. But guilt, it turned out, had its own patience. The witness described something they had seen on the night of Katarzyna's disappearance. A figure, carrying something, moving with purpose through the streets toward the direction of the river. The description was imperfect. 18 years is a long time. And memory is not a photograph, but it was enough. Combined with the environmental evidence, combined with the behavioral profile, combined with months of surveillance that had built a quiet, undeniable picture. It was enough. October 4th, 2017, 4:47. In the morning, the streets of Krakow were completely silent. That deep, pre-dawn silence that belongs only to the hours before the city remembers itself. Specialized unit moved into position around a residential building in a quiet district. No sirens, no announcement, no warning, because if they were right about who was inside that apartment, if everything the investigation had built over 18 years was accurate, then this was not a man you warned, this was a man you surrounded. The operation lasted less than 90 seconds, doors forced, commands delivered, and then silence again. Robert J. was on the floor, hands behind his back. He hadn't run, hadn't fought, hadn't panicked. He was simply calm. The kind of calm that unsettled every officer in that room, because it didn't look like the calm of a man caught off guard. It looked like the calm of a man who had always known this moment would eventually come and had decided long ago exactly how he would meet it. The search of the apartment took hours. What the team found inside transformed a criminal investigation into something that felt like archaeology, like excavating the interior life of a man who had spent decades building walls between who he was and who the world believed him to be. There were journals filled with observations and sketches, organized, methodical, the product of a precise and disciplined mind. There were hidden compartments, concealed with the same patience and care that seemed to define everything about him. And at the back of a closet, behind objects arranged to discourage attention, there was a small locked box. Inside were personal items, items that did not belong to Robert J. Items that suggested, with a quiet, devastating certainty, that Katarzyna Zowada may not have been the beginning of this story, only the chapter the river had chosen to reveal. Trial began in 2019 and stretched across 3 years. Much of it was close to the public. The nature of the evidence, the court determined, required it. What leaked into the outside world came in fragments, pieces of testimony, fragments of the forensic reconstruction. But those fragments were enough. Experts testified about the environmental evidence, the microscopic connection between the materials recovered from the river and the controlled environment Robert J. had worked in for years. Behavioral analysts described a profile built across decades of observation. The witness account placed him in the right location at the right time. The defense argued what defenses always argue in cases built on circumstantial architecture. Doubt the absence of a single, undeniable moment. But the prosecution's closing argument returned to something simple. The evidence didn't tell one story pointing toward Robert J. It told 20 separate stories, each one independently pointing in the same direction. At some point, coincidence stops being coincidence. At some point, the only explanation left is the truth. The verdict came in 2022. Guilty, life imprisonment. The judge's statement described the crime as possessing a cruelty without parallel in the recorded history of Polish criminology. Words that, in a courtroom full of people who had spent years immersed in the details of this case, still landed like something physical. As the sentence was read, Robert J. sat behind reinforced glass, still, silent, exactly as he had been throughout the entire trial. And then, as the guards moved to escort him out, as the room began to exhale for the first time in hours, he turned slowly and looked back at the gallery, not at the judge, not at the prosecutors, at the room, at the people, and for one brief moment, a moment that every person present would describe differently, but remember forever, something crossed his face, not remorse, not defeat, something quieter than that, something almost like satisfaction, the smile of a man who understood that while they were taking him to a cell, the questions he was carrying would remain outside those walls, free, unanswered, permanent, the Vistula River still runs through Krakow today. Tourists photograph it in the golden afternoon light. Couples walk its banks on summer evenings. Children throw stones from the old bridges and watch the ripples spread and disappear. The city has forgotten, the way cities always forget. But the case of Katarzyna Zowada left something behind that doesn't wash away. Because even now, even with a man convicted, even with a sentence handed down, the most important question has never been answered. Only a fraction of her remains were ever recovered. The rest? The river doesn't say. And Robert J. He has never spoken a single word about what happened. Not in interrogation. Not during trial. Not in the years of imprisonment that followed. Just silence. The same silence he used to build the perfect crime. The same silence that protected him for 18 years while a city searched and a mother grieved and a file sat in a room growing heavier with every passing year. Some investigators believe the full truth is hidden somewhere in the outskirts of Krakow, in a location that was never found, that may never be found. A place known only to one man who has decided the world will never know it. Others believe the story is larger than one man. That Robert J. was a chapter, not the whole book. That somewhere in the architecture of what he did, there are connections that the investigation never reached. No one knows. And that uncertainty, that open, unhealed wound at the center of a solved case, is perhaps the most disturbing legacy of the Vistula Mystery. Because we want our monsters caught and our stories finished. We want the verdict to mean the darkness is over. But sometimes a case reminds you that justice and truth are not the same thing. You can lock away the man and still lose the answers. That some secrets don't live in people, they live in silence. And silence has no sentence. Katarzyna Zowada was 23 years old. She wanted to be invisible. She wanted to move through the world without disturbing it. In the cruelest possible irony, a monster made sure she would never be forgotten. Her name is still spoken in the hallways of Jagiellonian University, still whispered along the banks of the Vistula when the fog rolls in and the tourists have gone home and the city returns to itself. She deserved better than the story she was given. She deserved to be remembered for who she was, not for what was done to her. But memory is complicated. Rivers carry everything eventually. The Vistula is still whispering. The question is whether anyone is still listening.